Hello, everybody. Dear Mr. Minister, dear Johannes Lindner, dear Dean of PSIA, dear Arancha, dear guests and colleagues, dear students, thank you for being so many with us today in Boutmy. So it is my great honor to welcome you to Sciences Po for this keynote speech on European policy and security policy. So on behalf of PSIA and the School of Public Affairs especially, thank you again for being with us today. It is also, of course, a great pleasure to have you with us as partners with the Jacques Delors Centre. So thank you, Johannes, and I will leave the floor to you in a minute. So as you may know, this event is part of a series of Franco-German dialogues to stimulate debate on Europe. Students of the Paris School of International Affairs and of the Master in European Affairs, especially at the School of Public Affairs, are no doubt waiting to hear your views and to be enlightened, but also to ask you questions on the European defense strategy, its goals and future in a context of international turmoil, social and political instability within many member states. So without further ado, I would like to thank you again, Mr. Minister, and give the floor to Johannes Lindner, co-president of the Jacques Delors Centre. Thank you.
Also, warm welcome from my side. Just 4 very quick points that we wanted to share with you, also to explain why we framed the event in the way we did. First, many thanks to the Foreign Office for the money that they're giving to the series that we call Pariser Platz Dialogue, and also the good cooperation we have with the 2 schools that are here in Sciences Po supporting that. That's my first point, but my second point is more on content. I mean, you mentioned Franco-German relations, and I'm saying this at the day when the Commission President presented the commissioners, and when I read in the press that some say this was a German coup because Breton had to step down. And it shows to you how quickly sort of Franco-German relations can sometimes become emotional. And at the same time, we are in our both countries seeing that domestic politics is very much in the focus and that Franco-German relations are not so much in the focus. So you have the 2 sides sort of emotional flaring up, and at the same time, sometimes the focus is not on Europe, the focus is not so much on collaboration between France and Germany. And in that respect, I think these events and the forum of providing collaboration beyond the main politicians, but also among administrations, among civil societies, are playing a very important role. Third point, it's funny, it's exactly almost to the day that 70 years ago, the Assemblée Nationale rejected the proposal for a European defense community. And if you think how, in a way, the course of European integration took a very different stance after that, we focused the European communities very much on economic integration and not so much on security. And now, 70 years later, and when picking that topic, we thought it's actually a nice turn of going back to the question of what means security for Europe. And I think it's important when we have this debate how profoundly the nature of the European Union is changing when returning in a way to the topic of security. Think of industrial policy, think of military cooperation. And fourthly, we're super happy, Tobias Lindner, to have you. And we've not chosen you because we share the same last name. As you know, also the finance minister is called Lindner, so Lindner is standing for quality, but it's certainly a name that is common, and Tobias and I, we are not related, just for the records. And with this, I hand over.
Dear Arancha, dear Anne-Célia, dear Johannes, students, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, for those of you who have seen my CV, you know I've worked in academia for quite some years, and it feels always good to stand in an auditorium and not only to address students, that's easy, reading a written speech or something, but to have a frank and open discussion with you. And second, this is not part of my speech, but since you said it's an important day since a new commission will be announced, and you have spoken about the narrative of a German coup regarding the French commissioner. You know, it's not my opinion, but some in Germany perceive Ursula von der Leyen as an employee or bigger friend of Emmanuel Macron than of Olaf Scholz. So if you take the two narratives together, I believe we can be quite fine. It's a great pleasure to be here today at this remarkable place of scientific excellence and innovation, and to engage with you on security policy in times of turmoil. France and Germany are not only connected by strong ties across the whole spectrum of our relationship with academic exchange, for example, we are also coordinate closely at the highest political level regarding geopolitical challenges of our times. At the end of May, the Franco-German Defense and Security Council, chaired by President Macron and Chancellor Scholz, gave important impulses to strengthen security in Europe in the light of the illegal Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. And I have to start with that. Russia's war has destroyed the European security order, on which I believe in both of our countries our prosperity and our security relied on, and has fundamentally changed, therefore, our security and defense policy. The goals Putin pursues with this war are not limited to Ukraine. Putin aims to changing the status quo. He wants a powerful Russia with control in a region which he still sees as the sphere of Russian influence, and he clearly aims for a dominating Russian role on the European continent. Russia is systematically preparing for a confrontation with the so-called, to quote, Western Hemisphere. It is modernizing, and we just heard 2.4 million soldiers. It's expanding its armed forces, including its nuclear capabilities. It has undermined and broken security and disarmament treaties like the INF Treaty. And since the beginning of the Russian war against Ukraine, further aggressive measures followed. Russia has converted into a war economy. It has further expanded its armed forces. It has adjusted its military leadership structure, and it is engaging in the militarization of its society, including schools. No less dangerous are the concentration of power in the hands of one person, Vladimir Putin, his revisionist view on European history, and the increasingly dictatorial nature of his rule. Hence, the joint assessment in France and Germany, in NATO and the European Union is clear. Russia is and will remain the biggest threat to peace and security in the Euro-Atlantic area and beyond. And let me be clear, it will remain that even after a Ukrainian victory in that war, I'm quite sure. Now, what does this persistent threat mean for the future of the European security architecture? Bluntly speaking, we cannot paint ourselves a better world than it is. We cannot escape from Putin's confrontation with the West. We can either submit to it by appeasement, not an option, or we can strengthen our own deterrence and defense, including continued support for Ukraine. The French government and my government, together with our NATO and European partners, we have decided to opt for countering Russia's expansionist path. It is therefore important that we as Europeans stay focused on three key aspects. First, our support for Ukraine. In a cruel war of attrition, Ukraine is not only defending its own country or fighting for its own freedom. It is defending Europe's security. It's defending our freedom and our values and the rules-based international order. And therefore, a continued support to Ukraine is crucial. And let me add one point, which I believe you have the same discussions in the French public than we in Germany, and which we also need to communicate to Mr. Putin. We are supporting Ukraine for reasons of solidarity. We are supporting them for sure because we believe it's the right thing and it's their legitimate right to defend themselves, for sure. But we are also supporting them for our own European, or we can even say national security interest. If we want to preserve peace in Europe, if we want to protect NATO, then an alternation of borders by force in the 21st century must not happen in the end. And that's the main reason why we will continue to support Ukraine. Germany is and will continue to be the largest provider, not only of military support, of financial and economic support too. We will continue our support, to quote my chancellor, to Ukraine for as long as it takes and intensely as needed. In the European Union, we are currently working together on enabling the G7 mechanism to provide a loan to Ukraine based on the interest accrued by immobilized Russian sovereign assets. This is a key priority for the German government, aiming at establishing the mechanism before the end of this year. This loan shall be a substantial addition to the support currently provided, including military support. For us Europeans, it is crucial to send the unmistakable signal towards Russia that we continue to stand together in full solidarity with Ukraine. Given the tense military situation on the ground and Russia's ruthless air attacks against military and civilian infrastructure across the entire country, especially on the energy grid and the energy supply, this support is needed more than ever. We will continue to strengthen Ukrainians' air defense, both with our initiative for immediate action on air defense and by providing further systems to Ukraine on a bilateral basis. We will also contribute to the efforts of other partners and are, with almost 600 million euro, the largest contributor to the Czech Republic's ammunition initiative, which alleviates critical support shortfalls for Ukraine's defenders. And we have also imposed unprecedented sanctions against Russia, showing Putin the price of this war. Second, we need to strengthen Europeans' security and defense. We must invest in the credibility of our deterrence and defense at NATO and increase European contributions, strengthening the European dimension in NATO. The North Atlantic Alliance will remain the bedrock of our collective security, and we must do everything we can do to strengthen the contributions of European allies to do it even more in the future. And this means closing critical capability gaps and jointly developing and procuring military equipment. We have initiated the European Sky Shield initiative, which aims at boosting European air and missile defense capabilities. 22 countries already have joined the initiative so far, and together with France, Poland, and Italy, we have signed a letter of intent to develop European long-range strike weapons to shore up gaps in the European defense. This step, ladies and gentlemen, was thoroughly prepared by the Franco-German Defense and Security Council, chaired by President Macron and Chancellor Scholz. We have also made progress on the way to strengthen defense preparedness in the European Union. We are currently negotiating the European Defense Industry Programme, a draft EU regulation with the aim of providing initiatives for investment in security and defense, as well as strengthening the European armament industry. We have agreed to establish the EU rapid deployment capacity and are working towards its operational readiness next year. It will us allow to quickly react to crises in our own neighborhood, and that is needed much more than ever. And last but not least, we need to invest in international cooperation and crisis management. European security is challenged by crises and tensions around the globe. We must therefore continue to work on our networks beyond Europe. The EU's global outreach is an important step to engage with our partners, and given the multiple crisis situations in the world, some of which are in our immediate vicinity, be it in the Western Balkans, in the Caucasus, Gaza, the Red Sea, the European Union is facing an increasing demand as a security actor. With the EU partnership in Moldova, the mission in Armenia, or the maritime operation Auspicius in the Red Sea, just to name the most recent deployments, Europe is actively contributing to security, stability, resilience, and peace in those regions. And we need to continue using the EU's full crisis management toolbox in this regard, also as a means to counter Russian influence in fragile contexts. So, dear students, ladies and gentlemen, to sum up, the security situation in Europe and beyond, it will remain difficult. Maybe it will become even more difficult in the future, we don't know. For us Europeans, this means we not only have to stay united, we have to become even more European. We have to take more responsibility for our own security and defense preparedness, as well as for stability and peace in Europe and in our neighborhood. I thank you for listening, and now I'm looking forward to your questions and comments. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. You've understood that here we are family. It's the School of Public Affairs with the School of International Affairs, with the Jacques Delors Institute, and now also with the German Foreign Office. So welcome to the family. Let me start with a question about threats. It's true that we have the close threats, the most immediate ones, but it's also true that there are other threats around us. We've got the Sahel, we've got the China Sea, we've got the Middle East. So what should be the ambition for Europe? Where should the European Union put its ambition in terms of defense and security footprint?
Now, I would describe it as a center where you have many surroundings around. So for sure, at the core of European security interest, there must be security in Europe and the wider region. And as I said, we must strengthen the European pillar within NATO. And I know everyone is looking on November the 5th in the United States. Regardless of the result, we must do more in the future on our own, regardless who will be elected as president. So that's at the core of European security. But you mentioned the Sahel, or we could look at the wider region. I know that in both of our countries, both migration as well as threats emerging from terrorist organizations are a big issue. So even though we had to withdraw from Mali, we had to withdraw from Niger, for instance, we need to have a common European approach to the region. If we just ignore the region and say, okay, that's not our interest anymore, they don't want us, in 5 or 10 years, problems or challenges might come back. And then you mentioned China and the Red Sea, and maybe many of you are aware that just 2 days ago, a German frigate crossed the Taiwan Strait, where we say it's something very normal for us because it's the international water, it's international sea. But looking at the Indo-Pacific, we need to keep in mind that almost 60% of the global GDP are located in the Indo-Pacific. We are highly dependent on that region in both directions. As an export market for our companies, for instance, German automobile companies are highly exposed and highly invested on those markets, and at the same time, we are dependent, and I would even say too vulnerable, with respect to critical, one-sided dependencies, be it on rare materials, be it on battery stacks for EVs, be it on semiconductors. Meaning that we need to have a holistic approach what security in that region must mean. For sure, it must be a political approach, it must be an approach strengthening alliances with like-minded partners as well as with the ASEAN countries. And at the same time, regarding economic security, a lesson hardly learned by my country looking at the fossil fuels from Russia, we need to diversify our supply chains as well as our export markets so that economic power cannot be misused to exert political pressure on the Europeans. Sorry, that was a long answer.
No. I mean, I think it's a very kaleidoscopic way to look at security in Europe. let's talk money. How are we going to finance our defense and security ambitions in Europe?
If I'm honest, I know that in France, next year's budget is a big issue. Okay, let's start that way. We all know the challenges. I would say something really has changed in our societies, especially in my country, where we have the phrase Zeitenwende, so epochal shift of times. I believe the public has understood that we need to increase defense spending significantly. If it's about investment in infrastructure, in systems, in ammunition. In Germany, I would say there is a maturity in the public to spend more than 2% of our GDP for defense. That's a good development. The same is understood much more longer here in France. At the same time, both of our countries are facing tough debates on next year's budget, since we have to shrink our public deficit, and we cannot increase it more and more and more. So that's the analysis. If you ask me how to do it, I'm not concerned regarding my country for next year, since we have this 100 billion euro special fund for military procurement. So this year, Germany will be at 2.1% of its GDP with respect to military spending. Next year, we will be also above 2%. And then my answer would be, we will be having elections most likely next fall, next September in Germany. You cannot expect a solution that touches the rules in our constitution before election day, since you need 2/3 of the parliament, since you need the opposition within. No one will do that before election day. Why should Friedrich Merz and the opposition do it? But everyone has the same analysis. So my prediction is, being now more than 12 years in politics, that after election day, when we are having coalition negotiations, everyone will look at the numbers. And then you need to do something. Maybe another special fund, maybe an amendment or a modification of the what we call Schuldenbremse, of the debt rule in our constitution, which does not yet differentiate between debt for investment and debt for, let's say, pensions and salaries. So something will happen, I'm sure, because everyone supports not everyone, but 4 out of the 6 parties in parliament, more than 75% of the parliamentarians support and share the analysis. I'm not really concerned, but I don't have the solution yet on the table. I see the options, and that's it. And if we are honest, we hear this question very often from our friends abroad the pond in the United States. No parliament in the world approves a budget for 5 years or something. The French don't do it, we don't do it, the Americans don't do it. You can only make guarantees for next year. That's called democracy. So I'm not concerned, really.
So what about the idea of common borrowing in the EU to finance defense? This is something that the President of France and Kaja Kallas, who's now the High Representative for Foreign Policy and Security, co-authored in a letter just before the European election. How does that sound?
I can only tell you my very personal opinion as an economist on that. I became a member of parliament in 2011, so at the rise of the so-called Euro crisis, and I was directly sent to the budget committee at that time. So the idea of common borrowing is nothing new as we know it for various purposes. My personal opinion is I'm open for such suggestions if we really save money, if it really helps. But then we always need, and sorry, that's very German, we need some strict rules how to do it, so that it doesn't expand indefinitely. We need to agree on the projects, we need to agree on the capabilities, we need to agree on the rules how to serve the loans in the end. But if it helps, if Putin is standing at the borders of NATO or the European Union and threatening us with the military, it doesn't help if we say to Mr. Putin, but we always went compliant with the German Schuldenbremse. That's not deterrence. Deterrence is battle tanks, ammunition, ships, aircraft. So we need to be quick and we need to do it now.
Good. Let's look at the industrial base. Huge capacities in the European Union, and still we are the continent that purchases the largest amount of military equipment from abroad, 80%. What should we do?
So what should we do? At the moment, maybe we even need to continue with what we are doing and trying to get better. What do I mean by that? Tell you the German perspective. When my party entered government in December 2021, we were confronted with lacks of investment into the German armed forces. We needed to replace a fighter jet called the Tornado, multi-role combat aircraft, which was introduced into the Air Force at the beginning of the 80s, and which I'm now allowed to say, 4 years ago we even didn't say that, which is the backbone of our commitment to the nuclear sharing arrangements of NATO. And we need to replace it by the end of this decade, full stop. So we cannot start together with others to develop a new fighter jet, being able to be the nuclear carrier within the NATO arrangements. We need to do it now. So the only option on the table was to procure the F-35. We had a demand of heavy transport helicopters. We decided in favor of the Chinook because the demand was 40 to 60 helicopters. No one in Europe will start a development project for such a low demand. Same with other projects. So on short term, we need to do something because we need to fill the gaps, and we need to fill them now. And we need to be interoperable with other European actors. But on the long run, we need to get better with European procurement projects. As long as I'm in politics, everyone is speaking about more efficiency in European procurement, having common projects, and so on and so forth. And many projects failed. There are some which are really good examples, like together with Spain, France, Italy, and others, the A400 military transport plane, for instance. We are developing a UAV together. We are developing the future combat air system. I know here it's called SCAF. So we are doing something. But I'm very much in favor now to look what are the requirements, both with respect to military support for Ukraine, as well as with the NATO defense planning process. And they are classified, but I can tell you these are large requirements. Everyone knows that we need to invest into a deep strike capability of the Europeans, conventionally. Mm-hmm. My country is solving it on short term that American troops are stationing American long strike missiles. I'm very much in favor to develop in a next step a European system. So where we need to get better is to anticipate what's needed in 10 or 15 years in the European armed forces. And if we do that, then there will be a lot of opportunities to be more European on that.
So let's look at institutions, let's look at people. Just this morning, the President of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, announced her roster of commissioners. Among those commissioners, Commissioner Kubilius, Lithuanian, would be Commissioner for Defense and Space. What should Mr. Kubilius' first steps be? What should his priorities be?
First of all, strengthening the European pillar. I would explicitly say here the EU pillar within NATO does not mean doubling the structures. So I'm very much open to look at funding, to look at investment plan, all those things. But we should do it in a way that we are strengthening the European pillar in NATO, not as a substitute, but complementary. That's the first thing, so looking from the top. Then I would very much recommend to speak intensively with the different European countries. Because if we are honest, we have different views still. And there will be different views in the future. I give you one example. France is a nuclear power. So France is very much aligned to strategic autonomy with respect to its own deterrent. The French defense industry, it's not state-owned, that would be too harsh, but it's closer to the government than it is in Germany. We are capitalists, we believe in I say this with some irony, in free market economy when it comes to defense. There are very different approaches to that topic. And I believe if you just wait until these approaches converge, it might be too long. So I would recommend to look, okay, how could these approaches, let's say, complement to each other? How can we bring them in line? How can we live with the differences? That's what I would recommend. And with respect to space, we must have European capability, both in the rocket systems, in the carriers, as well as in our capabilities in space, be it in reconnaissance or surveillance, be it in other capabilities. We must have a sovereign European capability on that.
So, of course, in the European Union, things work when there is a bit of leadership. So let's look at the leadership on this defense and security space. We've got, on the one hand, France, that is struggling to put together a government, and on the other hand, Germany, that is looking forward to the next electoral cycle next year. So where will the leadership come from? How do we put a bit more power into the engine room?
First of all, I would say you need leadership anyhow, even if there is an election circle or the formation of a government in the end. We have to take into account France is a presidential democracy and you still have a president. So there is leadership from the French side, even though we all have question marks, how will the next French government look like? And on the German side, the crises in the international sphere, they will not pause or stop just because we are having an election. So that would be my first answer. My second answer would be you need Germany and France because we have the largest, if you take the Brits aside, if you look at the European Union, we have the largest defense budgets in Europe. So many projects will be dependent on our decisions on military spending, if we are honest. And I believe, it will not be, the common procurement projects will not be a bottom-up approach where 27 countries agree on something and then it will emerge and then something miraculous will come out. That's not the case. It will be more top-down. It will be two countries agreeing that, for instance, we need to develop new aircraft like SCAF, and then others like Spain and Italy will join the problem. That's the way how it looks like. And that's the way how it must be. It must be an open house policy. That's my point. We will have the case that some European countries will move faster than others in that case, simply because of the size of their defense budgets in the end. But it needs to be an open house policy in the way that others can contribute and join, be it in production, be it in intellectual property, but also be it on the demand side, so that we have more interoperability in the European forces.
Right, so I'm going to ask Minister Lindner a last question. So I would suggest that those of you who want to have a go at questions start queuing in one of the mics. And while this is happening, Minister, you mentioned the UK. Mm-hmm. It's a very close neighbor. It's a European country, and it has nuclear capacities. How do we work with a UK that is outside the EU but inside NATO?
We need to do it. First of all, we recognize in Germany that the new British government wants to work closer with the Europeans, with my country, with France. What I should say, being in Paris, that the Franco-German relationship is and will be unique, full stop. And besides that, we are trying to work closer with the Brits. And my answer would be, if we strengthen the European pillar, let's say the EU pillar within NATO, it will be no contradiction to the Brits. They are also in NATO, they are at the European continent, so that's very natural. And if we try to, as EU, to better fulfill the capability requirements of NATO, that's also something where the Brits benefit from. So that's the only approach we can pursue. And then at some point it needs to be some kind of open house and not some kind of exclusion. Let me give you one last example. I know that France has decided in favor of Dassault aircraft for its Air Force, and we have decided in favor of the Eurofighter. But the Eurofighter is produced from Airbus and BAE Systems. Airbus is also a French company, or let's say European company. And when we are, let's say, exporting Eurofighters to country X, Y, Z, it might not be to the happiness of Dassault in the end, but also French industry, French workers are benefiting from it. And that should be our approach, keeping in mind that we have various options.
Excellent. All right. So briefly state who you are and put your question to the minister. Gentleman over there.
Okay. So thank you first of all for coming here to Sciences Po and for your presentation. So I'm Nicholas Zimmermann. I'm in MIGD. And my question would be related to the Russia-Ukrainian war. So as most interstate wars enter the negotiation table, so I mean, of course, we want to avoid that the borders are pushed or moved. But how are we supposed to avoid it in the at the negotiation table? How can we put in enough weight that at the end the borders are exactly where they stay? And if that's not the case, how can we deter other countries to do the same as Russia did, for example, with the Philippines or regarding to Taiwan? Thank you.
Your question is a temptation for me because you're asking a government official to speculate in the end, and I shouldn't do that. What I usually say in Germany is that Ukraine must win this war, and then I'm repeating by explaining what I do mean by victory. And as you rightly said, all wars in recent history have ended with some sheet of paper, with some document. Even the total surrender of the Nazi regime ended with a document which was called total surrender. So there will be, I think we all agree, some sheet of paper in the end. And I mean by Ukrainian victory that the conditions written down in this sheet of paper, that the main conditions are drafted in Kiev or decided in Kiev and not in Moscow. What these conditions exactly are, we don't know. It's up to the sovereign decision of the Ukrainian people and their government in the end. What I cannot do is to speculate about borders and about modifications and about whatever. But if you would ask me, okay, what's the German interest? As I said, not to incentivize the aggressor. That he might continue, or you mentioned the Philippines or other regions on the planet, or that others might see the example, oh, in the end, we are benefiting from it. I personally, don't quote me on that, but I personally believe that Putin is not weird. He's not crazy. He's a bad guy, but in his mind, he does something like a cost-benefit analysis. And I want him to step off the battlefield in the conviction that the costs were higher than the benefit. That must be the end game. And last comment, so that you don't see that I'm just trying to avoid from your question on issues of the territory. We shouldn't give, that would be very German. Germany is a country of experts. We have 83 million people who could be the national coach of the soccer team. What do I mean by that? Don't give any stupid advice from the sideline. Why should we differentiate between Crimea and the region in the eastern oblast of Ukraine? Why shouldn't we do it? If we stick to international law, both regions are illegally occupied. So the only position we could take is that we expect from Russia to withdraw completely from the Ukrainian territory as it was internationally recognized in 1994. And if the Ukrainians in the end want to do something differently, it's their decision. But it's not our recommendation or advice. That would be my point.
Thank you. I'm going to take the lady over there.
Hello, my name's Eileen. I'm an analyst at RAIN and an alumni here at SIA. I wanted to think a bit more about the future, so to speak, and an element of defence that we cannot really see or measure until it's too late. So thinking a bit more about cybersecurity. I feel with traditional security, something that we can see and measure very concretely, but with cybersecurity, we cannot. So thinking more about the increases that we're seeing in cyber attacks, in Trojans, in malwares that we're seeing by the Russians, also by the Chinese, by the North Koreans as well. In terms of the European Union, how can we strengthen cybersecurity for the future and ensure that we're further protecting our critical infrastructures and making sure that it's something that we can actually measure and that policymakers are thinking about it today, not so much what's going on in Ukraine, which we can see immediately, but thinking a bit more ahead in 5-10 years' time, so to speak. Thank you.
First of all, you're totally right. What we are also, at least have started with in NATO, is to draw the bigger picture about the Russia of the future. As I said, I'm convinced that Russia after Putin and after the war most likely will not be a better one than today. Unfortunately, I don't have a better message for you. So we need to prepare for it. And last year, the German government for the first time adopted a national security strategy, which takes a holistic view on the issue what security means, including cybersecurity. And I would add disinformation. When we are looking at elections, be it the European election, be it your parliamentary elections, regional election in Germany, we have indications that there's a spread of disinformation also with respect to social networks. What should we do? First of all, we need to have a broader understanding of security. We need to invest more in our own capabilities. You know, as a public sector, it's always a challenge to pay cybersecurity experts at an accurate level so that they work for the government. We need to be better in detecting such campaigns. We need to also advise private companies, be it in the defense sector or otherwhere, but also, and that's, I don't know if it's very German, but you know, I'm coming from a federalist country compared to France. The largest target for hackers at the moment are local municipal authorities in Germany. For the Germans in the room, Kreisverwaltung. So where your local data of your passport, of your tax statement is stored, where most of your personal data lies. We need to strengthen them. So it's about defense and recognition, but it's also to be about cooperation. We need to have established mechanisms bilaterally, but also on the European level, about our findings, about our countermeasures. And last but not least, and I believe NATO was very wise in its statement on the summit last year, you know, many of these measures are taken in the knowledge that they are below Article 5 of NATO, that they are something hard to detect and to attribute. So NATO said in its strategic concept, as far as I can remember, even cyber attacks may trigger Article 5. I believe that's a very wise notion, because it gives the opponent or the aggressor some ambiguity, but it doesn't exclude that if you transfer your warfare into the cyberspace, that you're in a safe space. You're not.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, gentleman over there.
Sehr geehrter Herr Staatsminister, ma chère Madame la Directrice, thank you for being here. My name is João Pedro from Brazil. We hear some people say that NATO is today an outdated organization or obsolete. And although there are initiatives like PESCO, the Permanent Structured Cooperation, we still see that military integration is still very fragmented in Europe. And I would like you to say if you believe that a common European army is a realistic goal in a short or medium term here in the European Union, maybe, I don't know, to replace NATO someday. And how do you think the France-Germany partnership can act in this goal? Thank you.
Okay, let's start with NATO. You know, a few years ago, some president, I can't remember his name, called NATO brain dead. And we have witnessed the opposite in these days. NATO is not brain dead, and what he meant by that at this time, he was right, by the way. So there was, if you go to Brussels and ask NATO officials what's NATO, they perceive themselves as being a political organization with a political core of values. And at that time, when President Macron said it's brain dead, NATO was really, there was a vacuum of a consensus of values and interests. Yep.
Finishing that, people say that since the end of the Soviet Union, there is no more need for NATO.
You know, the Soviet Union is over, but Russia is still our biggest security threat, and we need to rely on also on the capabilities of our American friends and partners, by the way, because even though we might discuss European capabilities with respect to deterrence, you know, I don't want to live in a Europe where we have to invest in large numbers of strategic nuclear missiles. I'm very much aware about the French deterrent, and I'm very grateful for that, by the way, that because it contributes to the deterrence of NATO as a whole, but I don't want to live in a Europe where we have to substitute the American capabilities, and therefore NATO is needed. But speaking about Europe, we need to keep in mind that NATO does not the whole job alone. Deterrence, in my personal view, I know it's not what's in the textbooks about security policy, but there's also some kind of economic deterrence. If you look about the sanctions against Russia after the full-scale invasion in Ukraine. And this is something which cannot be done by NATO, which needs to be done by the European Union, and then in close coordination with the Brits and the Americans. So what I mean by that is that the European Union has some complementary contributions to security as a whole, and it's not just some part within NATO where you make it more efficient. The European Union can offer you something if you have a holistic view on security which NATO cannot offer. That's the important point. Regarding a European army, and maybe you have seen some article when I was in opposition a few years ago, when I was very much in favor of a European army. And by the way, I would be happy before I die in hopefully a few decades if this dream comes true. But we can make steps towards it. So even though today it's something which is very far in the future, when I was born in '82, no one thought of a common European currency. So
yeah,
let's wait and see. But what can France and Germany do better? I'll give you one example. I'll be very honest with you. We have the German Franco Brigade. And in German armed forces, sometimes there's the saying, if you want to never go to a deployment, serve in that Franco-German brigade, because it was never deployed in the past as a brigade. Parts of it were deployed, but never the brigade as a whole. You should overcome this saying. And what we need to do is not only more common systems, but also common training for our soldiers, especially vis-a-vis doing the staff officers course, because we need to mutually understand the thinking of our troops and of our military leaders. And there's much room for improvement. And last but not least, we need to work on the language barrier. When I see, we know we have a Dutch-German corps in Münster, and their German is something everyone more or less understands. And we need to train the soldiers better, that they mutually understand with each other on the Franco-German brigade. I tell you some concrete examples which we can do very quickly in enhancing our mutual cooperation. Last but not least, because I don't wanna draw a picture that's only desperate, there is already progress. You should keep that in mind. So, for instance, with respect to tactical air transport, we have both Germany and France procured American, the 3 C-130 something, which is smaller than the A400M, and we have stationed it together in Evian in France. And German soldiers are now stationed in France, working with their French comrades in the same unit. And if we need the planes, we can do it. If you need the planes, you can do it. We don't do so much jointly together, but we have common training, common maintenance, and that's a nucleus for cooperation. So just take that point. We are not living in a world where everything's desperate and we just need to improve. We have started, and I'm deeply convinced about such projects.
Thank you. Gentleman over there.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. I'm Antoine. I'm a second-year student at the School of Public Affairs. You said the Ukraine victory is a key to our European values and defense, and you also talked about economic deterrence. However, the German government has announced to cut by half its financial aid to Ukraine. It refuses to provide long-range weapons and praises for a peace treaty with Putin, which reminds me something like 1938, and is very divided about the Mario Draghi's economic report, and France is not doing really better. Therefore, our fiscal balances and standards of living, are they more important than Ukraine, the Ukrainian people, and our defense? Thank you.
Okay. I'm trying to get point by point. First of all, on Draghi. You're totally right. If you look at the public reactions to the Draghi report, and I highly appreciate that report, you see differences, which is something natural if you have coalition government and something. What I recommend and what I would predict is if you read it carefully, if people are getting sober and relaxed and wait 1 week or 2 weeks and then looking really thoroughly and carefully into the recommendations and findings, I believe consensus will grow. On large range missiles, my own minister has made very clear that Ukraine needs capabilities with respect to wider ranges, be it ammunition, be it other things. What we are trying to avoid in the German public, because Germans are very good in that, just to concentrate on one military system and believing that the system might either lead to an escalation or either might be the miracle which solves the war. Both is wrong. You need to evaluate, and the Chancellor made very clear that one of his preconditions is that German soldiers are not getting involved into the targeting process itself. This is something which is agreed in the government. If there might be other solutions, I'm not allowed to speak about it because that's classified. But going, so you know that's the pity with the discussion. You cannot really have a frank and open discussion because they go into real details of the system. I have 2 main points. First, on the military support for Ukraine next year. You're right that the draft of next year's budget, the draft handed over from the cabinet to the parliament, says 4 billion euros, while this year we are spending 7 billion. But that's not the end of the story. Last year, the draft was also at 4 billion euros, and then in the parliamentary process, it was amended to 7 billion. And the parliamentary process has just started last week, and it will take until the end of November. So I can only ask you, first of all, to be patient, second, to be optimistic, and to wait. The good news is, and I've served in the budget committee for more than 10 years, that there is a political will out of the 4 major parties in the parliament, the coalition and the CDU-CSU opposition, to have a sufficient spending on military support for Ukraine. That's the good news. So there is a political will, and if there's a will, I'm quite sure there will be some kind of solution. And as I said in my speech, we need to get this windfall profits so that we can increase the amount of spending. Last but not least, because you made a right observation, if we go out on the street, if I go to my constituency and ask to quote ordinary people in a pub, or it would be in a nice restaurant or cafe, people wouldn't care anymore so much about Ukraine. Maybe in Germany they would care about if it's linked to refugees and if Ukraine would lose the war to increasing number and so on, but not about the military threat in itself. And this is something, I don't use it as an excuse, but it's something very human. I have a 2-year-old son. If I go with him on the street, he's afraid of cars. If you go out on the street, you're not afraid of cars. even though they are not more or less dangerous than to my son. You are not afraid because you're getting used to the risk. Getting used to a risk is something, and then you perceive it as being less risky. That's my point. That's something very human. So what could we do as politicians in the end? You need to explain. You need to explain why it's in your own interest. And honestly, you need to tell the concrete stories, the examples. You shouldn't tell about the Russian full-scale invasion in Ukraine. You need to talk about Irpin, about Bucha, about children being deported to Russia. You need to talk about individual biographies to keep the attention of people. That's my conviction.
Thank you. We're going to go to the balcony.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Lindner, for your insights today. So, on the topic of a draft, I want to ask a question about a different sort of draft. Namely, I want to ask for the minister's insight on conscription, because we've talked a lot about military equipment and how it can develop technology, but all this technology and hardware requires the personnel to use them. And the thing is, we see in Ukraine and Russia that they've both resorted to either full or partial conscription to have the amount of personnel to fight the war. And if Russia is a real security threat, then it seems that Europe will also need to commit a significant portion of its population to fighting on the front lines. I was wondering, for Mr., do you think that a system of conscription is necessary in the future for European security, to have a certain level of reservists who are trained that we are able to call up, just like during the Cold War? And if so, how do you think we can overcome public opposition to such a plan?
Okay, I start with telling the story about how it is in Germany right now, because there's a misunderstanding. Then about the plans of the Minister of Defense, and then about my own opinion. How is it right now? We have suspended, not stopped, suspended conscription. If you look into the German constitution, it says that male people can be conscripted to serve in the armed forces, full stop. That's still part of the constitution, but we do not use it anymore for more than 10 years, but there's still a legal option, a legal basis, if you want to do it, to approve a bill in the parliament with a simple majority, and then you can reintroduce conscription. The Minister of Defense, Boris Pistorius, has the idea that every young man at the age of 18 gets a letter from the Ministry of Defense where there is a questionnaire, and you have to fill it, and then some are invited into the armed forces to get information, what you can do, if you serve voluntarily or not. And the hope behind it is that some are convinced in the end and that we have better numbers of recruitment. That's the state of play at the moment. If you would ask my own political party, the Green Party I'm affiliated with, I would say that most of the party members are against conscription. I personally would say that I'm open to look how Sweden is doing it, for instance. They are even inviting every young man one day to the armed forces to tell him, and usually I would say it should also be for women, but I do not see the 2/3 majority in my parliament to amend the constitution to say young men and women can be. But by the way, I think it should be handled equally. But the idea in Sweden is we are invited one day to the armed forces, which is like day on the job. It's a presentation where they show you, and then some voluntarily sign up for a year or something. This is something where I don't get goose pigs or something, where I would goosebumps, where I would say, okay, if that's necessary, maybe think about it. Honestly, and if we are honest, we are not good at the moment in recruiting soldiers. We can be better. It's not a normal job, but you are facing a competition on the job market. That's the challenge. And you need to tell young people why they should serve, what they can do, and what they can do afterwards they have served in the army. You need to give that answer too. If you sign up yourself, let's say for 12 years, as a part-time soldier, we call it Soldat auf Zeit, then you need to qualify them within this 12 years that they can be on the job market later on. And we have to, and you mentioned the word, we have to be better with our reserve. Many, you know, I made a 5-day on-the-job course in the armed. So I did civil service when there was conscription, and 20 years later I decided to save 5 or 6 days with the tank troops as a soldier. So legally I'm part of the reserve. I've never received a letter from the armed forces being invited to a reserve training or something else. They do not even know if they have me in their database. So we need to be better in keeping the data about the reserve, making offers to them, what they can do as reserve soldiers or officers, and there's lots of room for improvement. So my answer would be start with better recruitment, improve how you handle the reserve, and then think about, let's say, low measures with respect to conscription. And if these 3 parts help, then I sleep well.
Thank you. Gentleman over there.
Thank you, Mr. Staatsminister, for coming. My question is related to this. Polish and Baltic state intelligence has placed a potential full standoff of NATO against Russia by 2027 or 2028. Currently, the German military, given its current budget trajectory, would need several decades to re-establish its 2004 level of armament. Do you believe this is the time for budget constraints, or is it potentially the time at a European or maybe at a national level for some sort of raison d'etat, for there to be more state intervention, perhaps even potentially outside of the law, in order to make sure Europe is prepared?
Well, first of all, you know, I cannot make comments to intelligence finding from our Baltic or Polish friends, but I can quote the German Chief of Defense, General Breuer, and he said the same in public. And so I would say you're not wrong in your assessment, and this assessment does not come out from some craziness. This is something we need to be prepared for. Second, you're right that there are still some gaps. I personally believe, no, I'm convinced that the budget is not the only bottleneck. You have to look at industrial capacities as well as on the personnel. So even if the budget would not be a bottleneck, there are some other challenges. Third, we are doing already a lot. Last Friday, I, together with the Minister of Defense, Boris Pistorius, have signed with our Lithuanian counterparts the agreement on stationing on a permanent basis a whole brigade of German soldiers in Lithuania before the end of this decade. This is something new for the Germans. We have only stationed such a large number of soldiers twice, I would say, in history, in Kosovo or on the Balkans and in Afghanistan, but not on a permanent basis. And in a few years, 4,000 to 5,000 soldiers together with their families will live in Lithuania. This is something really new also for German strategic culture. And if you would ask me about my opinion to your question, my answer would be, you know, we have NATO, we have the commitments and the decisions of the Washington Summit. We have a defense planning process. This defense planning process will assign capability targets to NATO members. And Germany should do everything it can to fulfill the capability targets assigned to Germany. Full stop.
Thank you.
Thank you. Gentleman over there, followed by the balcony.
Thank you very much for coming and answering our questions. My question is about popular support for defense spending. I mean, you were talking about it a lot. And at the moment, I very much agree that there's a consensus in the German society that we should spend a lot on our military. But at the same time, we can also see that this is starting to collapse in a way, like the BSW, for example. They're gaining a lot of votes in all major parties in the SPD and the CDU. There is important personalities that start to be against military spending. So now, if you were also talking about how important industrial capacity is, and private military companies need those long-term guarantees in a way to make investments. So how can the German government assure them that even in 10 years and 15 years, the same demand for military contracts will be there?
Okay. I need to structure my answer, and let me start cynical. German government, no government in any democratic country can guarantee that. Because there happens every few years something which is called an election, and you quoted, for instance, Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, BSW. If they would get an absolute majority in parliament, they have the majority to draft a budget, and that's the risk of living in a democracy. I cannot give you any guarantee. Second, we are not lost. So what can be done? First of all, to sustain public support, you need to spend the money wisely, meaning if you have procurement scandals, if you have increasing costs, delays, quality problems, usually public support is decreasing. We all know that. So it's also an obligation both of our procurement authorities as well as of the industry not to promise something which they cannot fulfill. And as long as we haven't developed enough European capabilities, sometimes we need to procure off the shelf. Second, and it seems rather technical, but I believe it's not technical. My own minister proposed a second, similar to the special procurement fund, to the Sondervermögen. You are losing the public debate if you have budget constraints, like Maastricht criteria applied to the French budget, or in Germany, the Schuldenbremse, the debt ceiling, and if you need to increase military spending, because then you are telling people you are investing less in schools or whatever, or social security, and then that's a fight you cannot win. So the proposal of my minister was to say, okay, let's put security outside this debt rule. Have another special fund or something, so that you can say to the people, yes, we need to save some money. We need to constrain the budget, but it will not be constrained due to military spending. At least that's a better argument, and it helps you answering your question with respect to long-term planning. The special fund, and you know that the German Supreme Court last year ruled on so-called special funds, on Sondervermögen, that a multi-annual approach is very often in the German system not constitutional. The military special fund, it is, because it's part of the constitution. And I advocate to set up another special fund, maybe larger, maybe for 10 years and not for 5 years, because that gives the reliability to the industry, and you can make long-term contracts, and the money isn't lost if it's not spent by the end of the year, which is part of the code of budget. And last but not least, we need to convince the public. We need to invest in the public debate. It's sometimes time-consuming. You need to drive around the country. You need to speak to people, but you should do that. I can tell you that for many times, if you look at the campaigns of the former Chancellor Angela Merkel, she tried to avoid security policy issues during her campaigns, because maybe she was afraid or convinced you're losing elections speaking about the difficult or not so friendly topics. But when I travel around Germany, I see a demand. Really, people are thirsty getting explanations. When I assemble a group of people, they are not coming to get my view, or their main purpose is not to be convinced by Tobias Lindner that Tobias Lindner is right and the others are wrong and they should re-elect Tobias Lindner to parliament. That's not the main reason why they are coming to such gatherings. They are coming because they want to understand what's now Article 5, what's nuclear deterrence, why are we supporting Ukraine. They want to get some orientation to form their own opinion in the end. And if we don't do it, then others, populist groups, will do it and will give them some easy orientation or some easy explanation. I know that's a tricky answer because it's time-consuming, but we should try.
Thank you very much. Balcony up there.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your intervention, Dr. Lindner, and thank you for your insightful analysis on German mortality and perspective, especially with the significant belief in free market economics when in terms of the defense industry. But you used that argument, the belief in free market economics, for rejecting European industrial preference in key areas, and I'm referring to here when the German government bought 35 F-35 planes instead of the Rafale, the French Rafale. You mentioned that the government also bought a few Eurofighters, of which some parts are built by Airbus. But I'm just wondering, shall we remain at the whim of foreign elections, which we can't intervene and take part in? So I'm mentioning here the US. And shall we not think about, perhaps preserving our industrial capabilities, which you mentioned a few times, to defend ourselves, and therefore perhaps by setting a sort of European preference in terms of industry in key areas such as defense?
Thanks a lot for your question, because it gives me the option to clarify something. I would even doubt that I believe in free market economies in these days, but I try to describe the situation. And if you negotiate common procurement projects like SCAF, Future Combat Air System, where you have Dassault on the one hand and you have Airbus, which is handled at the stock market and which is more a private-oriented company, and where you have industry partners below those two big companies, things are getting difficult. We cannot give, as a German government, order to German fully private-owned companies to do this or that. And that's not an excuse, but it means it makes it complicated. I very often admire the French, how structured the defense sector is. If Élysée Palace decides something, then DGA, the French authority for procurement, says exactly the same. And the industry knows what they are saying, and they behave being in line and not throwing rocks into the way. And the German approach, and in other countries, is at least difficult, and that makes it difficult. But you should try. And clarifying on the F-35, I would have no problem to procure Rafale for our nuclear deterrence. Don't have any concerns. But maybe you are aware that putting an American nuclear missile under a French Rafale would require by the Americans to hand them over all the blueprints and all the intellectual property from the Rafale to American authorities. I have met no person here in France who is willing to do that, and I can understand that. So, and the same is true, by the way, for the Eurofighter. We don't want to give the blueprints of the Eurofighter to anyone else. So the only option when we rely on nuclear sharing, and I have understood my French counterparts that we should continue as Germans to be part of the nuclear sharing arrangements, and these are made by American nuclear missiles. The only way how we can do that is in the end by procuring American fighters for that purpose. And that's not a contradiction to a future combat air system. I very much, and the German Air Force, we are very much convinced, we agree on that we need to have a concept of the Air Force that always relies at least on 2 different fighter jets. Because if you have a technical issue with one model, you need to be resilient, or you need to have a backbone with the other model. So it's not a contradiction. And the amount of F-35, it's 35 F-35. It's not even a whole replacement of the Tornado. We have 90 Tornadoes on stock. We do not replace them by the F-35. So that's no contradiction, but that's the description of the challenges we are facing at the moment.
Thank you. Gentleman over here.
I think the mic is off or something. Okay, then just speak up or try. Trying to give a quick answer, I believe it's a good decision to have a commissioner for defense and space. if we are honest, we are not at a European Defense Union yet, and it may take lots of time. But Europeans are very much in favor when they are facing a challenge, first speaking about structures or about a legal structure or something, then facing the challenge and the matter in itself. So I believe it's good that we have one person, one point of contact for defense and space. That's an improvement, and it helps to strengthen and to get the European approach more coherent, and therefore it's a good idea.
Thank you. We're going to go, let me just see. We're going to go over there, and then we're going to go up again.
Thank you. My name is Yannick Hartmann. I'm studying international security here at PSIA, and I would like to pose a question vis-à-vis the US elections. Let's be frank, and you hinted at it, I think we can all agree that no matter who takes the White House in November, US interests will continue to shift towards the Indo-Pacific and China, leaving a huge leadership vacuum in Europe. And specifically in the area of defense, Europe is rather seen as liability than an asset to the US. So my question to you, Herr Staatssekretär, how is the foreign ministry currently preparing for either outcome of the US elections, and how do you plan on specifically tying or continue to tie US interests to the European continent?
I have to be a very bit unsharp on how we prepare, but what I can tell you is, in 2016, I believe many European countries had a series of denials when it comes to Donald Trump. The first denial was he will never be the candidate of the Republican Party. Second, he will never be elected as president. Third, he will be like Ronald Reagan or something. And all three were wrong. Now the pendulum has shifted into the opposite direction, and I believe many governments are very carefully preparing for both election outcomes. So it's no secret that we are reviewing our whole policies under both scenarios. What does that mean for trade, climate action, security, NATO, Ukraine, China, you name it. What I like about your question is, because I have to mention that's a very, very desperate work in the end, because sometimes you are drawing a picture that maybe does not look good if you also look at public announcements and if you have seen the recent debate. What I like about your question is that you said no matter who will be elected as president in the end, there will be some long-range trends. The US will be more interested on domestic affairs, be it infrastructure, migration, whatever. There will be a shift to the Pacific, and so on and so forth. And I believe you should focus on those trends. No matter who is elected, it might be a different temperature, attitude, whatever, but the trends will remain the same. What would be my answer to that? My answer would be, first, we need to convince the Americans that we are not a liability, we are an asset. We are an asset both militarily in itself, in the matter in itself. Close to my constituency, there is Ramstein Air Base, the largest US air base outside the United States, which is a big benefit for them. Just to give you one example. Second, the United States, that they can be safe, their security relies also on the fact that on the other side of the Atlantic, there are Western liberal democracies. If it would be different, we would be a concern for them. We should emphasize that. Third, we need to take more responsibility for our own security and the security of our neighborhood, for sure. That's obvious. We need to do more in the future. And last but not least, and that's very often underestimated, we also need to take care about the Indo-Pacific. I mentioned previously 60% of the global GDP are coming from the region. There are superpowers, or however you might call them. There's China, India, Japan, Korea, you name it. And we should take care I would say, in two dimensions. Really traveling there, exchanging with countries, having alliances, trying to cooperate. Also, I know the French position to that NATO, and that's also the German position, it's a transatlantic alliance. At the same time, we need to interact with the so-called Asia-Pacific Four.
recently Germany has deployed a frigate and a support ship to the region. As I said, we have just crossed the Taiwan Strait. So these are all things, but the main message I would send to the Hill in Washington is, we appreciate that you have understood that your security is linked to what's happening in Ukraine. It's not only about the military situation on the ground, it's about food prices, energy prices, inflation, repercussions to the international rules-based order, so on and so forth. If we appreciate that, we should send a signal to the Hill that we have understood that our security is also linked to what's happening in the South China Sea and in the Taiwan Strait. Not in a narrow military sense, that the Chinese Red Army might invade France or Germany. That's not my point. But that we are highly dependent on semiconductors and rare materials. I've once read a study that if the semiconductor supply from Taiwan is interrupted for 1 year, the German GDP would almost go down by 20%. More than during the COVID pandemic. Correct me about the number, it might be 18 or something, but it's a significant number. And that's linked to our security. Imagine in your country, GDP would go down by 1/5 what would happen outside on the street. And we shouldn't ignore that. And we should therefore send the signal we have understood that message. And in case we cannot send any carriers or something, but we need to work together, be it on sanctions, be it on other things. That would be my message, that since the US are supporting the European sanctions, we could do vis-à-vis the same in case of. And therefore, also part of deterrence, trying to prevent a military escalation in the region.
Thank you. I'm going to take a question there, and then we'll go up to the balcony.
Hello, thank you again. So my question has to do about the European enlargement. So how do you think the integration of countries such as Moldova, Georgia, Albania, or other countries, including Ukraine, whose ability to spend money on defense may be a bit limited, may affect the development of a strong and common European defense system, or as you said, a stronger European pillar in NATO? So would it be more of a constraint or an enabling factor? Thank you.
I would say it's more an enabling factor. So, again, it's speculation. I would say if you do it rightly, it will be more an enabling factor. We have to keep in mind Ukraine is the country in Europe which is, unfortunately, used to fight. These maybe are the best experienced soldiers we have in Europe, if we are honest. So it can be an enabling factor. On EU enlargement, we have to keep in mind both. We have to make those countries fit to join the EU, and it's a condition-based approach. So it's up to the countries to decide about the speed of the accession. But we also need to make the European Union itself fit for enlargement, meaning that we have to speak about our decision structures, but not only about that. We have to speak about the priorities, about the budget, about spending money more efficiently in the end. And we need also to do that homework. And if you do that right, it can be an enabling factor. I grew up when the European community had 12 members. And sometimes I'm afraid we are still in some points in that mindset. And if we come to the European Union, it's more than 30 members, or almost. Don't forget about the Western Balkans. It will be a different, as the nature of the European Union changed in 24, when there was the Eastern expansion. It will change. If those countries join the EU, it will change the nature of the European Union, and it can change it even to the better.
Thank you. Gentleman up there at the balcony.
I just want to say first, thank you so much for being here, Minister Lindner. I'm American, so I don't frequently have this opportunity, so I really do appreciate it. My question is about space. So space is frequently regarded as the future of commerce and defense. The US Space Force since 2019 has more than doubled its funding to $29 billion per year. And in 2022, EU leaders identified space as a strategic domain in the strategic compass for security and defense. And further, according to the European Defense Agency, while EU-owned and operated space assets are primarily under civil control, there is a pressing need to enhance the security and defense dimensions of the Union in space. And so thus, my question is, in what ways can Germany's national space strategy complement EU efforts to improve security, defense, and responsible norms in space? And how could both work together to enhance collaboration with the United States Space Force?
And you've got 3 minutes.
Okay, I'll start with the good news, that a few years ago the German armed forces recognized space as a domain, as a crucial domain. And if we see all these inspection satellites, for instance, we know that space, at least, it might not be a place for warfare, but it's an enabling or disabling factor if you put satellites out of operation or not. We have our own space command within the armed forces. And what I can tell you from my daily work is that we have a close exchange with European authorities as well as with US authorities, both about capabilities. And as I said, we need own European capabilities as well as national capabilities. And we have a frank exchange about the threats and the challenges in space. And I believe, space might be one of the most expensive domains. We need to do an efficient work share between the Europeans and the Americans on that.
Thank you. We just have got 2 more minutes. So only the very, very pressing short question. Gentlemen.
I should give short answers, okay.
Thank you, Mr. Lindner, for coming here, and your presentation has been very inspiring. And since you have mentioned the Taiwan Strait question about the German ship across the Taiwan Strait, and I'm very curious about that. Will we see an increasing engagement or involvement for Europe in those regions who are not traditionally geopolitical interests in accordance with the European Union, like in the regions like in Asia and East Asia specifically? And will we see increasing engagement of EU, no matter under the framework of NATO or a more Europeanized security framework? Thank you.
Okay, let me just collect very, very quickly the last 2 questions and then we close. Lady over there.
Private sector route.
Thank you, and the final.
Hi, Minister. I'm Martin Makarian, exchange student from Johns Hopkins University in Washington, D.C. My question is, how does the German government respond to accusations of hypocrisy of German stance when it comes to other conflicts like Israel and Palestine or Armenia, Azerbaijan? Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, start with situation in Gaza and this double standard accusation. What will we do? We are trying to explain, and we are trying to travel a lot, and we are trying to explain that our position is balanced. I'm traveling to many Arab countries as well as to Malaysia, to Indonesia, and sometimes my counterparts are even surprised when I tell them, we have imposed as Europeans, for instance, sanctions against violent settlers in the West Bank, trying to explain that Germany is the 2nd largest donor worldwide when it comes to humanitarian assistance in Gaza, and so on and so forth. You need to give the arguments. And many do understand that we are trying to use our special relationship to the state of Israel, and I have to be very precise, to the state of Israel, to speak to the government of the state of Israel, to the elected government, and at least that they listen to us. In these days, it's even some progress if at least they listen to you, even though we have clearly outspoken, for instance, on the situation in Rafah. On finance of defense companies, you have described very well the challenges that also to European regulations, defense is not perceived as something being sustainable. My conclusion would be discuss, explain, speak to the public. It's also where do you put your savings? And maybe in the European Union, when we have a new commissioner, they will look on it. And to the Asia Pacific, will there be more engagement? Yes, for sure. I would say, first of all, political engagement. There will be more visits from European politicians. Germany just recently, last year in August, opened an embassy in Fiji. So there will be engagement for economic reasons, for reasons of diversification, for reasons that the notion West is not a geographical notion. It's, I would say, a notion, do you share the values of liberal democracies? And it will also be about fighting the climate crisis. These countries are much more vulnerable to climate change than other ones. On the military side, we are doing something every year. We are trying to participate in exercises, for instance. We do not send a ship every year. We have deployed the Air Force, the Army, and we are not doing it to provoke someone. Our position is we are committed to a one-China policy, but every alternation of the status quo of the Taiwan Strait needs to happen peacefully and in mutual consent, and therefore driving through the Taiwan Strait for us is something very normal. But the purpose that the frigate is in the region was, for example, to participate in the surveillance of the UN sanctions regime against North Korea when it comes to missiles and other things. And I believe this is something good. And what will happen in the future will be, I believe, more European, also together with our French friends and allies. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I survived. Thank you so much. But I think you have noticed it was fun for me a little bit. I like it.